Chapter 17, Employee Stakeholders and Workplace Issues. Our renewed focus on employee stakeholder issues has been a direct outgrowth of the kinds of social changes that have brought other societal issues into focus. Today's issues are quite unlike the historical concerns of higher pay, shorter hours, more job security, and better working conditions. These expectations still exist, but they now embrace more complex workplace trends and issues. Three major themes or trends characterize the modern relationship between employees and their employers: the evolution of the social contract, the practice of employee engagement, and the expansion of employee rights. First, we will discuss the evolving social contract between organizations and workers, which is different from contracts of the past. Second, we will consider the continuing trend toward more and better employee engagement in the workforce. Third, we will examine the concept of employee rights, and we will describe how changes in the workplace have precipitated a renewal in the employee rights movement. In particular, we will focus on the right not to be fired without good cause, the right to due process and fair treatment, and the right to freedom of speech in the workplace. Even today's full-time employees do not look for a promise for full-time employment. Instead, they seek competitive pay and benefits coupled with opportunities for professional growth. At the same time, they want meaningful work, a vision that they can share with the company, clear performance feedback, and a strong, supportive organizational culture. Some analysts argue that a key driver of an organization's ability to survive and thrive into the future will be the social contract that firm has with its employees. The changing social contract, which is figure 17.1 in your text, presents some of the characteristics of the old and new social contract between employers and employees. Engaged employees are those who identify and have an emotional commitment to the organization. They consistently bring an extra effort to their roles in the organization in support of its goals. Companies that support employee engagement through mentoring programs, career development training, and annual employee surveys that result in actions have notable key outcomes, including outperforming companies who do not have active employee engagement programs in areas of customer ratings, profitability, and productivity. Additionally, they have significantly less turnover, less shrinkage, less absenteeism, fewer safety incidents, and fewer quality defects. It is easy to see how this aligns with good stakeholder management, and specifically the supportive stakeholder approach that was discussed in Chapter 3. Despite such successes in employee engagement, though, a recent Gallup poll found that the majority of U.S. workers surveyed, approximately 50.8%, said they were not engaged with their jobs. Perhaps even more alarming is that employee engagement has not experienced large year-over-year improvement in Gallup's 15-year history of measuring and tracking the metric, with employee engagement consistently averaging less than 33%. So what is the problem? Some say that employee engagement surveys don't get enough buy-in from executives and organizations. One survey of Inc. 5,000 firms found that fewer than 2% of CEOs look at employee engagement survey results more than once. Some say that the feedback data from employee surveys is often unwieldy and doesn't take into account employee sentiments. The irony of this is that thanks to technology and big data, it is easier to identify key employee issues that could affect performance. Despite these obstacles, employee engagement is a concept that is central to most businesses' employee stakeholder management. It is particularly important as businesses deal with an increasingly digital workforce while still trying to instill a sense of identity with the organization that might inspire loyalty and commitment. A brief comment on the role of labor unions is appropriate here. In general, although labor unions have been quite successful in improving the material conditions of life at work in the United States, pay, fringe benefits, and working conditions, they have not been as active in pursuing civil liberties. For our purposes, we will approach employee rights from the principle of rights perspective, and viewed from this perspective, rights are justifiable claims that utility cannot override. Employee rights can be positive or negative. Said differently, they can focus on achieving desired outcomes or on prohibiting unwanted outcomes. Richard Edwards has grouped employee rights into three categories based on the fact that these rights find their source in law, union contracts, or employers' promises. Rights provided by the law are called statutory rights. These include, for example, the rights established by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 at a national level, or by the Massachusetts Right to Know law at the state level, which grant production workers the right to be notified of specific toxic substances they may be exposed to in the workplace. Union contracts, by contrast, provide workers with rights established through the process of collective bargaining. Examples of these rights are seniority preferences, job security mechanisms, and grievance procedures. Employer promises are the third source of employees' rights characterized by Edwards. These employer grants or promises are called enterprise rights, and typical examples of these might include the right to petition beyond one's immediate supervisor, the right to be free from physical intimidation, the right to a grievance or complaint system, and the right to due process and discipline. Other enterprise rights include the right to have express standards for personnel evaluation, the right to have one's job clearly defined, the right to a just cause standard for dismissal, and the right to be free from nepotism and unfair favoritism. The three models of management morality can be found in Figure 17.2 in your book, and it characterizes how moral managers as well as amoral and immoral managers might view employee stakeholders. To summarize, employee rights may be based on economic, legal, and/or ethical sources of justification. In this way, management may provide the employee rights as a part of an effort to be socially responsible or to display moral management. A good cause norm is the belief that employees should be discharged only for good reason. Just cause dismissal prevails in the United States today. The central issue in the movement to protect workers' job-related rights involves changing views of the employment at will doctrine. In the industrialized world, the United States is unique in adhering to this doctrine, which is based on the private property rights of the employer and the principle that the relationship between employer and employee is a voluntary one that can be terminated at any time by either party. This doctrine holds that just as employees are free to quit a company anytime they choose, employers can discharge employees for any reason or no reason as long as they do not violate federal discrimination laws, state laws, or union contracts. What this doctrine means is that unless you are protected by a union contract, and the vast majority of the workforce is not, or by one of the discrimination laws, your employer is free to let you go at any time for any reason. Three broad categories of issues that illustrate the legal challenges that have arisen with regard to employment at will discharges are public policy exceptions, contractual actions, and breach of good faith actions. States vary in their adoption of exceptions to employee at will, creating a patchwork of employment situations around the country. Only 3 states, Florida, Georgia, and Rhode Island, have never adopted an exception. A major exception to the long-standing employment at will doctrine is known as the public policy exception. 43 states recognize this exception. This exception protects employees from being fired because they refuse to commit crimes or because they try to take advantage of privileges to which they are entitled by law. The courts have held that management may not discharge an employee who refuses to commit an illegal act or performs a public obligation, such as serving on a jury or supplying information to the police. The exception sometimes covers whistleblowers, and we'll talk about whistleblowers later in the chapter. Workers who believe they have contracts or implied contracts with their employers are protected in 42 states that recognize the implied contract exception. The good faith principle suggests that employers may run the risk of losing lawsuits to former employees if they fail to show that employees had every reasonable opportunity to improve their performance before termination. As previously mentioned, the United States is unique in its adherence to the employment at will doctrine, and most people in the U.S. believe a norm of good cause applies to employment decisions. So it's not surprising that employment at will has been criticized on moral as well as legal grounds. The argument generally used in favor of employment at will is that employers invoke their property rights when they terminate an employee. Using the concept of employee property rights as the foundation, there are three objections to employment at will. First, they argue that employees deserve respectful treatment, which includes explaining the reasons for termination when it occurs. Second, employees do not have the option of being arbitrary or capricious with employers, and so employers should bear the same responsibility in their treatment of employees. A third issue is based on the concept of reciprocity. Employers are expected to be trustworthy, loyal, and respectful in their interactions with employers, and so employers should show employees the same consideration. Employment at will can present managerial problems as well. We should not forget that the impact that an employment at will environment can have on the culture of an organization. Most bad reasons for firing employees, such as discrimination, are already illegal, and managers can always fire an employee for good, justifiable reasons. With respect to employee dismissals, management needs to be aware not only of the content of the decision to dismiss, but also of the process for doing it. Treating employees with care is important not only to the terminated employee, but also to the survivors of the process, who then know they will be treated with care if they face a similar situation. A positive corporate culture can be preserved even in difficult times with thoughtful treatment of employees. The following are some specific recommendations for action. Fire employees in a private space. Don't terminate an employee in a way that enables co-workers to see what is happening or forces them to walk a gauntlet in front of them. Be mindful of employees' logistics. How will they get closure on projects? How will they get home that day? Preserve employees' dignity. If you have to lay off a trusted and a valuable employee for economic reasons, don't take up their IDs and cell phones immediately or cancel passports, etc. Choreograph the notification in advance. The purpose of the meeting should not be a surprise. And fifth, use transparent criteria for layoffs. The rationale for termination should be clear both to those laid off and to those who are left. The following are some of the actions managers should not take when dismissing employees. Don't fire on a Friday. Terminated employees would not have access to support services on weekends and so would have to cope on their own. Do not say that downsizing is finished. It's impossible to know for sure that downsizing is ended, and being wrong about that would make subsequent layoffs more difficult. And don't terminate an employee via email. And although this advice seems obvious, many firms have done so to the detriment of employees as well as their reputations. Stick to the topic. Don't say this is hard for me as it is for you. Don't rush through the meeting. Be willing to give a person time as a way of communicating that that person matters. Not to give the employee the time needed for the termination just really puts salt in the wounds. One of the most frequently proclaimed employee rights issues of the past decade has been the right to due process. And due process is the right to receive an impartial review of one's complaints or opinions and to be dealt with fairly. In the context of the workplace, the right to due process involves the right of employees to have impartial third parties review the decisions that adversely affect them. And due process, when formalized, is a system for ascertaining that organizational decisions have been fair. It aligns closely with the concept of procedural justice or ethical due process that was discussed in Chapter 8 of the text. The following are the main requirements of a due process system in an organization. It must follow the rules, sufficiently visible and so well known that potential companies can and do provide due process for their employees in several ways. Alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, is a term that refers to ways of resolving disputes that avoid litigation. It is a popular and yet controversial form of conflict resolution that the International Institute for Conflict Prevention and Resolution calls the dispute resolution divide, because there are constant calls for more standardization in ADR approaches. One of the most often used mechanisms to resolve differences in the open door policy is the open door policy. From the employee standpoint, the major problem with these approaches are that the process is closed. It's seldom reviewed by someone else. One person is reviewing what happened, and there's a tendency in organizations for one manager to support another manager's decision. The process is opened up somewhat by companies that use a hearing process, which permits employees to be represented by an attorney or another person, with a neutral company executive deciding the outcome based on the evidence. A similar approach to this is the use of management grievance committee, which may involve multiple executives in the decision process. A developing due process mechanism that has become popular for dealing with employee problems is the use of a corporate ombudsman, also known as ombud or ombudsperson. It's a Swedish word that refers to one who investigates reported complaints and helps to achieve equitable settlements. The ombudsman approach has been used in Sweden since 1809 to curb abuses by government against individuals. The ombudsman's task is quite different from that of the human resources manager. Hiring, firing, setting policy, and keeping records are all the responsibilities of the Human Resources Department, and the Ombudsman does none of these. In contrast, he or she is formally and officially neutral and promises client confidentiality. Ombuds can handle the concerns of employees who believe they have witnessed wrongdoing and do so in a way that keeps the problem from getting out of hand. The peer review panel is another due process mechanism that is currently in place. Eastman Kodak, now Kodak, made good use of the peer review concept when it dealt with a planned workforce reduction of 4,500 to 6,000 people. And the Society for Human Resource Management notes that it can be an effective way to resolve workplace conflict, providing that the aggrieved employee presents his or her side of the dispute to a small panel of employees and supervisors, or selected from a pool of employees trained in dispute resolution. As Ann Reisman, former General Counsel of the Equal Opportunity Advisory Council, put it, the benefit of using peer review rather than some external decision maker is that the peer review panel is well versed in the company culture and how the company operates. In addition, peers tend to find decisions handed down by peers to be trustworthy. The key to a successful peer review committee is to make sure that the people involved in the process are respected members, help the organization. Election rather than appointment of committee members helps participants to trust the independence of the process. The trend toward using ADR is growing with no end in sight. The growth is spurred partly by the time and money saved by avoiding costly litigation, ADR is not without problems. In particular, many observers have expressed concern that some employers were requiring new hires to sign contracts, waiving their right to sue the firm and accepting pre-dispute mandatory arbitration as the alternative. Arbitration is a process where a neutral party resolves a dispute between two or more parties and the resolution is binding. In mandatory arbitration, the parties must agree to arbitration prior to any dispute. Critics of the practice argue that this robs employees of their right to due process. They say that the structure of mandatory arbitration favors the organization and not the employee. As stated earlier, the current generation of employees has a different concept of loyalty to and acceptance of authority than that of past generations, and the result is an unprecedented number of employees blowing the whistle on their employers. A whistleblower is a former or current organization member who discloses illegal, immoral, or illegitimate practices under the control of their employers to persons or organizations that may be able to effect change. 4 key elements comprise the whistleblowing process: the whistleblower, the act or complaint about which the whistleblower is concerned, the party to whom the complaint or report is made, and the organization against which the complaint is made. So, 2 views of employee responsibility in a whistleblowing situation. This is figure 17.3 in your book, and it depicts these 2 views of employee responsibility. You have the traditional approach: employee, loyalty, obedience, confidentiality, corporate employee. Then emerging is you have the employee in the middle. Public has certain rights, and the employee has responsibilities to the public. Also, the corporate employee has certain rights, and they have the employee has responsibility to the corporate employee. And the whistleblowing has certain rights. And again, that's an act that is an option after weighing duty of loyalty to firm against duty to protect the public interest. A checklist to follow before blowing the whistle. This can be found in figure 17.4 in the text, and it depicts a checklist to be followed by whistleblowers before blowing the whistle. There are consequences of whistleblowing, and there are various types of corporate retaliation are often taken against whistleblowers by the employers. And the Business Ethics Resource Center surveyed 4,800 employees who reported the following top forms of retaliation and their incidents. The highest: exclusion from decision and work activities, cold shoulder, verbal abuse, they almost lost their job. 55% not given promotion or raise, verbal abuse, cut in the pay or hours, and 44% relocated or reassigned. One last thing about the False Claims Act, or the FCA. What is controversial about it is the magnitude of the financial incentives that individual employees may earn as a result of their whistleblowing efforts. And the law allows individuals to be awarded as much as 15 to 25% of the proceeds in cases where the government joins in the action, and from 15 to 30% of the proceeds in actions that the government does not join. Normally, employees pursue whistleblowing options after regular, less dramatic channels of communication have failed. And in a study of whistleblowers' protection, workers in a leading high-tech organization were asked if they felt safe speaking up about problems in the firm. And in spite of the fact this organization had a variety of formal mechanisms as ombudsperson and grievance procedures, half of the employees indicated that they did not feel safe speaking up. So wrapping up, the managers must be clear that they invite and accept suggestions. These are suggestions on how to accomplish the goal. A study was done and there were clear implications for encouraging free and open speech in the workplace. And it's not enough to remove barriers or put formal mechanisms in place, but significant changes in the organizational culture must occur if organizations want to deal fairly with employee stakeholders. And the following are suggestions for how to accomplish that goal. Managers must be clear that they invite and accept suggestions, and they must also invite them. They cannot implement all suggestions, but it's important for managers to acknowledge each one. Managers must refute commonly held assumptions and organizational myths that discourage communication. For example, they can encounter the commonly held belief that employees should give managers suggestions in private by explaining that only openly discussed ideas are likely to be useful. And managers should tailor rewards so that employees share more directly in any cost savings or sale increase from ideas they offer. Tangible rewards can help employees to overcome concerns. And that concludes Chapter 17.